Good evening, guys. Tonight, as the world outside quiets down and the stars begin to twinkle, we're going to embark on a journey back in time. Imagine a world without shiny porcelain toilets, instant hot water, or even soap as we know it today. We're heading to the medieval era, a period often painted with grand tales of knights and castles. But tonight, our focus is on something much more intimate and, perhaps, surprising: hygiene. Forget everything you think you know about dirt and disease from those old movies. The truth about how people in the Middle Ages stayed clean, or tried to, is far more complex and fascinating than you might imagine. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's gently step into a time where cleanliness was a daily struggle, a social statement, and sometimes a matter of life and death. One of the most persistent images we have of the Middle Ages, often fueled by old movies and popular stories, is that people simply didn't bathe. You might picture everyone coated in layers of grime, smelling like a forgotten stable, and completely oblivious to the very idea of cleanliness. But tonight, we're going to gently set that myth aside. While it's true that daily bathing as we know it, with instant hot water, bubble baths, and scented soaps, was practically science fiction to them, the medieval world was far from universally dirty. In fact, in the early parts of the Middle Ages, particularly following the lingering influence of Roman traditions, bathing was actually seen as quite beneficial. Monasteries often had their own bathhouses, and some towns even maintained public facilities where people could gather, soak, and cleanse themselves. It was a more communal, less private affair than our modern showers, but it was certainly a recognized part of life. However, as the centuries moved into the later medieval period, a significant shift occurred. The idea of immersion in water began to change, moving from a healthy practice to something viewed with suspicion, even fear. This wasn't because people suddenly enjoyed being unwashed, but due to a complex mix of new understandings, or rather, misunderstandings, about health, the spread of disease, and evolving social and religious beliefs. They believed that hot water, by opening the body's pores, could actually invite illness in, making a refreshing bath a dangerous gateway for plague or other sicknesses. Imagine the chilling thought: trying to get clean, only to believe you're making yourself vulnerable to death. This deep-seated fear, combined with a growing moral concern about the mixed gender and sometimes scandalous nature of public bathhouses, gradually led to a widespread decline in communal bathing, making the full-body soak a far less common, and sometimes even daring, act. So, as the idea of the grand communal bath began to fade in many regions, what exactly did people turn to for cleanliness? Forget the rows of brightly colored plastic bottles in your bathroom. In the Middle Ages, the tools for washing were far simpler and often quite ingenious, relying heavily on what nature and basic home remedies could provide. For those who still managed a full-body wash, which became more of a rare, special occasion than a daily habit, the water itself was a precious commodity. It usually had to be hauled from a well, a nearby stream, or a communal pump, then often heated over a crackling fire, a time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Once the water was warm, it would be poured into a large wooden tub, which might be lined with a clean linen sheet to prevent splinters and add a touch of comfort. For cleansing, they didn't have commercial soaps. Instead, they might use plain warm water, sometimes infused with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or chamomile, not just for a pleasant scent, but for their perceived cleansing or healing properties. Imagine the simple, earthy aroma filling the air, a stark contrast to our perfumed products. For something more abrasive, common household items like wood ash or lye were sometimes used. These substances, derived from the ashes of burned wood, could be quite harsh, but they possessed powerful grease-cutting and cleaning abilities. They were the medieval equivalent of a heavy-duty detergent, useful for lifting stubborn dirt but used cautiously on delicate skin. It was a very direct, hands-on approach to personal care, where the ingredients were often found right outside your door, and the process was a testament to resourcefulness in a world without modern conveniences. With full-body immersion becoming a less frequent luxury, what about the daily routines for staying fresh? This is where medieval ingenuity truly shines, as people focused on what was practical and achievable. For most, especially the common folk, daily washing was primarily concentrated on the hands and face. Water was a precious resource, often requiring a trip to a nearby well or river, so using large quantities for a complete wash every day simply wasn't feasible. Instead, individuals would use small basins of water, perhaps with a clean linen cloth, to quickly refresh these areas, which were most exposed to the elements and daily grime. Think of it like a quick freshen up rather than a deep clean. Dental hygiene also presented a unique set of challenges and solutions. The idea of a modern toothbrush or toothpaste was entirely foreign. Instead, people might chew on specific fresh herbs like mint or fennel to freshen their breath, or they would rub their teeth clean with coarse cloths. Sometimes, twigs from certain trees, frayed at one end to create a rudimentary brush, were used for scrubbing. While these methods weren't designed for a sparkling white smile, they aimed to keep the mouth as clean as possible and to combat the inevitable bad breath. Despite these efforts, body odor was an inescapable reality, as there was no deodorant or antiperspirant as we know it. People simply learned to live with it, often masking it with fragrant herbs worn in sachets or tucked into clothing. So, while a full scrub down wasn't an everyday occurrence, smaller, more targeted cleaning rituals were a definite part of medieval daily life, a constant effort to manage cleanliness in a world without modern solutions. Beyond the direct washing of hands and faces, another incredibly vital, though perhaps less obvious, aspect of medieval hygiene revolved around clothing. In a world where a full bath was a rare luxury or even considered dangerous, people relied on their garments to act as a crucial layer of cleanliness. The central idea was that certain fabrics, particularly linen or wool worn closest to the skin, could absorb the body's sweat, oils, and general grime. Think of these inner layers as a kind of built-in sponge, constantly working to keep the body itself feeling fresher for longer. This meant that while the outer, heavier layers of wool or fur might have gone unwashed for extended periods, the undergarments were changed much more frequently. For someone wealthy enough to own several sets, changing a linen shirt or chemise every few days, or even daily, was a practical and effective way to manage personal freshness. This was far more feasible than heating vast quantities of water for a full bath every day. Washing these clothes, however, was no small feat. It was a laborious, often communal, task. You wouldn't simply toss them into a machine. Instead, clothes were usually taken to a river or stream, or washed in large wooden tubs. The cleaning agents were typically wood ash or lye, which, when mixed with water, created an alkaline solution to cut through grease and dirt. Imagine the physical effort involved. Scrubbing garments against washboards or stones, pounding them to loosen grime, and then rinsing them thoroughly in cold water. After this arduous process, the clothes would be laid out to dry, often draped over bushes, fences, or lines strung between trees. Sunlight and fresh air were considered essential for drying and further purifying the textiles, as it was believed they helped to sweeten and disinfect the fabrics. So, in many ways, while a full-body wash might have been a distant memory for some, the act of regularly changing and vigorously cleaning their innermost garments was a continuous and essential part of maintaining personal hygiene in the medieval world. Now, let's turn our attention to perhaps the most visible, and often debated, aspect of medieval personal care, hair and dental hygiene. If medieval hair had a motto, it might well have been flammable but fragrant, and not always in a good way. Contrary to popular caricatures, people didn't generally wander around with matted, bird's nest hair, at least not intentionally. They did, in fact, wash their hair, though certainly not with the daily routine or specialized shampoos we're accustomed to today. The methods were far more inventive and, frankly, often quite harsh. A common choice for cleansing was lye soap, a potent mixture of wood ash and animal fat. While effective at cutting through grease, it could also be incredibly drying and irritating to the scalp. Imagine a medieval chemical peel just to get your hair clean. For those seeking a gentler touch, particularly wealthier individuals, remedies like egg yolks were sometimes used as a cleanser, followed by rinses with herbal infusions like rosemary or lavender, which also helped to mask other smells. Some even rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, might have left you smelling distinctively yeasty. But the goal was less about a glossy shine and more about simply trying to keep it clean and manage pests. Combing, however, was a very routine and important practice. Combs made from bone, wood, or horn were common personal items, intricately carved and prized. These fine-toothed combs were essential for removing tangles, dirt, and, crucially, lice, those unwelcome but ubiquitous companions of medieval life. For women, long, well-kept hair was a sign of beauty and status, often meticulously braided, coiled, and veiled. But dental care presented another unique set of challenges. Forget toothbrushes and toothpaste. These innovations were still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, sometimes with abrasive substances like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. Chewing on frayed twigs from hazel or elm trees also served as a rudimentary toothbrush, acting like a natural brush to scrub away food particles. To freshen breath, people chewed on pungent spices like fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom. In wealthier homes, mouth rinses made from vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water were used, though the effect was likely more about masking than truly eliminating odors. So, while a dazzling white smile wasn't a medieval aspiration, people made earnest efforts to maintain their oral health with the tools and knowledge available to them, however rudimentary they might seem to us today. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or perhaps, the odor in the alleyway, the scent of medieval life. If you could somehow time travel to a bustling medieval town square, your first sensory input probably wouldn't be the grand architecture or the vibrant market. It would likely be a powerful, unforgettable, and very complex smell. Because medieval Europe, lacking modern sanitation, deodorant, and plentiful bathing facilities, had a scent profile that was, shall we say, committed. Imagine a blend of animal waste from livestock and horses, the faint tang of human waste from chamber pots being emptied, rotting food scraps, smoke from open fires, and the ever-present aroma of unwashed bodies and heavily used textiles. It wasn't just a faint odor, it was an enveloping atmosphere. So, how did people cope with this constant assault on their noses? They got incredibly creative with masking and managing these pervasive smells. One of the most popular, and perhaps charming, solutions was the pomander. This was a small, hollow ball, often intricately crafted from metal, filled with strongly scented herbs and spices. People wore them around their necks, attached them to their belts, or simply held them to their noses when navigating particularly pungent areas. These pomanders were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, musk, or even ambergris, a highly prized substance derived from whale digestive systems, which had a wonderfully sweet and earthy scent. Think of it as their personal, portable air freshener, designed not to eliminate the smells, but to politely overpower them. Ladies often tucked scented sachets filled with dried herbs into their bodices, providing a localized fragrant bubble. Sometimes, herbs like rosemary or marjoram were even braided directly into hair, acting as a fragrant fashion statement that also served a very practical purpose. For the truly wealthy, perfumes imported from the Middle East or Italy were available, made from exquisite rose oil or civet, a musky secretion from a cat-like animal. These were dabbed sparingly, meant to provide a sophisticated veneer over the underlying reality. It was a constant battle against the olfactory chaos of their world, a battle fought with ingenuity, herbs, and a healthy dose of shared experience, since everyone was quite literally in the same boat, or rather, the same pervasive cloud of medieval musk. Now, let's explore a less glamorous, but undeniably essential, aspect of medieval life: waste management, or the lack thereof. In a world without modern plumbing or dedicated sanitation departments, going to the bathroom was an experience that varied wildly based on your social standing and location, and it often involved a good deal of improvisation. For the elite, living in castles offered a somewhat more structured solution. These grand fortresses often had what were called guardrobes. Picture a small closet or alcove built into the thick stone walls, with a simple stone bench that had a hole cut into it. Beneath this hole, waste would drop straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a dedicated pit, or simply onto an unfortunate patch of ground below the castle walls. These were typically located high up in towers, offering a modicum of privacy and the undeniable thrill of gravity at work. If you happened to be strolling below, you learned quickly to keep an eye, or rather an ear, open. For the vast majority of people, however, the peasants living in villages or the townsfolk in bustling cities, the options were far less refined. Most people simply did their business outdoors, in the woods, by a river, or discreetly behind a barn. Some larger villages might have had communal pits, essentially very rudimentary outhouses with minimal privacy, where your neighbor might be attending to their needs right alongside you, perhaps even discussing the day's events. When night fell, the chamber pot became the star of the show. These portable ceramic or metal pots were kept under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready for use in the dark hours. If you've never had the unique experience of emptying a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in pitch darkness, then you, my friend, are truly not medieval. And what happened to the contents of these pots? Often, they were simply tossed out the window, with a loud warning cry like "Gard Lou," short for Garzelo, meaning watch out for the water. This practice, while efficient for the individual, certainly contributed to the pungent atmosphere of medieval streets. Street sanitation, where it existed, was a crude affair, often relying on animals like pigs to scavenge refuse, or simple gutters and open ditches that frequently clogged, overflowed, and turned into stagnant, odorous pools. As for toilet paper, that was a luxury of the distant future. People made do with whatever was at hand: rags, moss, straw, leaves, or for the very refined, scraps of wool or linen. In winter, even snow could be pressed into service. It was a stark reminder that in the Middle Ages, personal convenience often came at the expense of public cleanliness. Doing the laundry in the Middle Ages was far from the simple push of a button it is today. It was a monumental task, a full-body workout, and often a very public affair. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be prepared for some serious physical labor, often battling the elements as well. Most laundry was done in rivers or large communal tubs, which, while providing running water, also meant dealing with the realities of medieval waterways, which often served multiple purposes, including waste disposal. It wasn't the sparkling clean mountain spring you might imagine. Doing the laundry in the Middle Ages was far from the simple push of a button it is today. It was a monumental task, a full-body workout, and often a very public affair. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be prepared for some serious physical labor, often battling the elements as well. Most laundry was done in rivers or large communal tubs, which, while providing running water, also meant dealing with the realities of medieval waterways, which often served multiple purposes, including waste disposal. It wasn't the sparkling clean mountain spring you might imagine. Once scrubbed clean, the clothes face the next challenge, rinsing and wringing, followed by drying. If it rained, the process stalled, and your carefully cleaned shirt might have to wait another day, perhaps even developing a new, unwelcome scent. Clothes were typically spread out on bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees or simple peasant huts. This often gave medieval villages the charming, if somewhat chaotic, aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Interestingly, despite the less frequent body bathing, clean clothes held immense importance. A bright, relatively fresh-smelling linen shift could signify that you had your life in order, even if your last full bath was weeks ago. In many cases, clean laundry was the primary form of personal hygiene, acting as a buffer between the individual and the pervasive grime of their world. No discussion of medieval hygiene would be complete without addressing the ever-present, undeniably itchy reality of pests. In a world without widespread pest control, people lived in very close quarters with an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. These tiny creatures were such a constant nuisance that they were essentially treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you simply had lice. They were the great equalizers of medieval society. Rich, poor, pious, or worldly, lice didn't discriminate. So, how did people cope with this constant, microscopic companionship? For lice, one of the primary methods was meticulous combing. Lice combs, often crafted from bone or wood with incredibly fine, closely packed teeth, were common personal items, much like a toothbrush is today. Imagine the tedious, yet necessary, task of carefully raking through your hair to pull out these tiny critters and their eggs. Beyond combing, heat was another key weapon. Clothes were often boiled or carefully baked near a fire to kill the lice and their nits, though this always came with the risk of accidentally scorching your only tunic. This is why you might see medieval illustrations depicting people holding their shirts near a flame. It wasn't just for warmth, but often a precise act of pest execution. Some individuals, particularly monks or those with practical reasons, even resorted to shaving their heads entirely, removing the primary habitat for these unwelcome guests. While a wig might sometimes be worn, if not meticulously cleaned, it could quickly become its own bustling lice hotel. Fleas presented a different challenge, especially for those sleeping on straw mattresses or living in close proximity to animals. Without modern flea collars or bug sprays, solutions were less direct. Smoke fumigation was sometimes used, and herbal sachets with strong scents were scattered between bedding, hoping to repel the pests. Certain strong-smelling herbs were believed to deter them. However, the ultimate solution for many was simply endurance. Everyone itched, and everyone scratched. It was just an accepted part of daily life, much like taxes or navigating muddy streets. The best you could hope for was that the fleas would find someone else smellier or more appealing. Let's shift our focus now to dental care in medieval Europe, a practice that was less about sparkling smiles and more about simply keeping most of your teeth. While certainly not ignored, oral hygiene was approached with a very different understanding than what we have today, relying heavily on ingenuity, natural materials, and, often, a good deal of stoicism. The modern toothbrush, that everyday item we can't imagine living without, was still centuries from being invented. So, how did medieval people keep their mouths clean? Instead of bristles and paste, common practice involved using linen rags to rub their teeth clean. These cloths might be soaked in something abrasive like salt, which acted as a natural scrub, or in crushed mint and even burnt rosemary ash, which provided a gentle polish and a hint of freshness. The primary goal wasn't whitening, but simply removing food particles and combating the ever-present problem of bad breath. If your breath didn't cause someone to politely step away, you were already winning the medieval dental game. Another popular method involved chewing sticks. These were thin twigs, often from trees like hazel or elm, which would be frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You'd chew on the twig until the fibers separated, then use this makeshift brush to scrub your teeth. Think of it as the original, organic, and rather bark-flavored toothbrush, fully compostable, of course. To freshen their breath, people turned to aromatic herbs and spices. Chewing on fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom was common, depending on what was affordable or available. In wealthier circles, people might rinse their mouths with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, the latter often used for embalming, giving a rather exotic, if slightly grim, twist to their oral hygiene routine. While commercial toothpaste didn't exist, some rudimentary versions did. Recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash, often mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. After using such a concoction, your mouth might not have felt minty fresh, but it certainly felt thoroughly sandblasted. When it came to serious dental problems, the dentists of the era were typically barbers or blacksmiths, individuals accustomed to tools and strong grips. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just causing unbearable pain, the solution was straightforward and brutal, that is, yanking it out. This procedure was performed without anesthetic, often with just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a quick prayer. Aftercare usually involved rinsing with wine and hoping for the best. Despite these stark realities, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Their diets were significantly lower in processed sugars, and many rural folk, whose diets were simpler and coarser, often had surprisingly better dental health than some modern populations. However, when decay did set in, it progressed rapidly, and the only truly effective cure was often, quite literally, divine intervention. So, we've discussed the general scent of a medieval town, but what about the equally pressing issue of body odor itself? In a world without our modern roll-ons, sprays, or clinical-strength antiperspirants, people simply sweated. And then they generally made peace with it, or at least tried to. Imagine living your entire life without deodorant, knowing that everyone around you, from the king to the local baker, was also experiencing the unadulterated reality of human perspiration. It wasn't just a possibility, it was an identity. To mask or manage the natural musk, medieval people employed various ingenious, if not always completely effective, tricks. One common method was the use of alum powder. This naturally occurring mineral salt possesses mild antibacterial and astringent properties. While it couldn't stop sweat, it could certainly help to cut down on the accompanying stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind the sensation of grinding rocks into your armpits. Other approaches involved using chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular choices, not necessarily because they were powerful odor blockers, but because they simply smelled more pleasant than unfiltered body odor. The logic was simple: if you couldn't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a fragrant herb garden. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs became quite the rage among the nobility. These weren't just for wiping brows. They were primarily held delicately under the nose when navigating crowded streets or engaging in close conversation, offering a temporary, personal shield against the prevailing odors. No one wanted to smell like medieval stew meat, but often, that was the reality. The best you could hope for was to smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medical beliefs also played a role. Physicians often believed that sweating was a healthy way for the body to purge bad humors, so actively blocking it was seen as suspicious, perhaps even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, to stink, and to allow your body to cleanse itself naturally. You weren't unclean. You were simply, in their medical view, fragrant. Compounding this was the fashion of the time. Layers upon layers of heavy wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture, creating a mobile greenhouse effect around the body. Combine that with open fires, hearty feasting, and the occasional terrifying plague outbreak, and you had a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone in this olfactory journey. Everyone around you shared the same fragrant reality, even the king, even the priests, even the woman selling you radishes who might not have bathed since Epiphany. In short, modern deodorant wasn't real, but shared suffering, in this case, a communal aroma, absolutely was. It might seem baffling to us why medieval people, despite their efforts at cleanliness, didn't simply get it about germs. The answer lies in their fundamental understanding of medicine and disease, which was wildly different from our own. They lived in a world without microscopes, without any concept of bacteria or viruses. Instead, their medical theories were largely based on ancient Greek ideas, particularly the concept of the four humours. This theory proposed that the human body was made up of four basic fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a perfect balance of these humours, and illness was caused by an imbalance. So, when someone got sick, the medieval physician's goal was to restore this balance. This often involved practices like bloodletting, removing blood, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, or prescribing specific diets. These treatments, while often uncomfortable, were believed to be actively removing the excess humours or badness from the body. Now, connect this to hygiene. If they believed disease entered the body not through tiny, invisible germs, but through miasma, literally bad or foul odors, or through the pores of the skin, then their hygiene practices made perfect sense. If hot water opened your pores, then bathing during a plague outbreak was like rolling out the welcome mat for illness. This wasn't ignorance, it was a logical conclusion drawn from their available scientific understanding. Their fear of water during epidemics wasn't about being dirty, it was about trying to stay healthy based on the best, albeit incorrect, medical knowledge of their time. They were trying, in their own way, to protect themselves from what they believed to be the true sources of illness, even if their methods ultimately proved ineffective against microscopic enemies they couldn't even imagine. Amidst the shifting beliefs and varied practices of medieval hygiene, there was one corner of society where a more consistent, and often more rigorous, approach to cleanliness persisted: the monasteries. While the outside world debated the perils of public baths or relied on sponge washes, many monastic orders maintained traditions of hygiene that were, in some ways, centuries ahead of their time. For monks and nuns, cleanliness was often seen as not just a physical necessity, but a spiritual discipline. Their rules and routines frequently mandated regular washing, not only of the body but also of clothing and living quarters. Monasteries often had dedicated bathhouses or washing facilities that far outstripped those available to the average peasant or even noble. These facilities, while simple by modern standards, might include troughs with running water, basins for personal washing, and sometimes even communal tubs. The monks would schedule regular bathing, understanding its importance for health and spiritual focus. Their disciplined lifestyle also meant that practices like hand-washing before meals were strictly enforced, not just for spiritual purity, but for practical reasons that, unbeknownst to them, helped limit the spread of disease. Furthermore, monasteries were often centers of learning and record-keeping. They cultivated herb gardens where plants with medicinal and cleansing properties were grown, and they meticulously copied texts that included knowledge of hygiene from classical antiquity. While the broader societal fears about bathing grew, many monastic communities held firm to their principles of cleanliness, creating small, relatively hygienic enclaves within a world that was often quite the opposite. Their routines for washing clothes, maintaining clean living spaces, and personal ablutions stood as quiet examples of what a more ordered approach to hygiene could look like, demonstrating that for some, cleanliness was indeed a form of piety, diligently practiced even when it fell out of favor elsewhere. Let's continue by looking at the more intimate practices of personal grooming beyond just washing. While grand full-body baths were rare for many, medieval people still engaged in daily routines to manage their appearance and comfort. For instance, nail care was quite important. Fingernails and toenails were trimmed, often with small knives or specially designed nippers made of metal or bone, and kept relatively short to prevent dirt accumulation and maintain dexterity. Imagine the precision required with such basic tools. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Long nails could harbor dirt and contribute to skin irritation, especially in an era of constant manual labor. Hair removal was also a practice, particularly among women of the nobility, who might remove hair from their eyebrows or foreheads to achieve the fashionable high hairline of the period. This was done using tweezers, or sometimes even harsh concoctions containing substances like arsenic or quicklime, which were incredibly dangerous but sometimes effective. For men, beards and hairstyles varied greatly by region and time, but keeping hair neat was a sign of respectability. Barbers, often also serving as surgeons, played a vital role in this, offering shaves and trims, not just for aesthetics but to maintain some level of personal order. These small, often overlooked, details paint a richer picture of how medieval individuals managed their personal presentation and comfort in a world without our modern conveniences. Let's continue by looking at the more intimate practices of personal grooming beyond just washing. While grand full-body baths were rare for many, medieval people still engaged in daily routines to manage their appearance and comfort. For instance, nail care was quite important. Fingernails and toenails were trimmed, often with small knives or specially designed nippers made of metal or bone, and kept relatively short to prevent dirt accumulation and maintain dexterity. Imagine the precision required with such basic tools. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Long nails could harbor dirt and contribute to skin irritation, especially in an era of constant manual labor. Hair removal was also a practice, particularly among women of the nobility, who might remove hair from their eyebrows or foreheads to achieve the fashionable high hairline of the period. This was done using tweezers, or sometimes even harsh concoctions containing substances like arsenic or quicklime, which were incredibly dangerous but sometimes effective. For men, beards and hairstyles varied greatly by region and time, but keeping hair neat was a sign of respectability. Barbers, often also serving as surgeons, played a vital role in this, offering shaves and trims, not just for aesthetics but to maintain some level of personal order. These small, often overlooked, details paint a richer picture of how medieval individuals managed their personal presentation and comfort in a world without our modern conveniences. Let's continue by looking at the more intimate practices of personal grooming beyond just washing. While grand full-body baths were rare for many, medieval people still engaged in daily routines to manage their appearance and comfort. For instance, nail care was quite important. Fingernails and toenails were trimmed, often with small knives or specially designed nippers made of metal or bone, and kept relatively short to prevent dirt accumulation and maintain dexterity. Imagine the precision required with such basic tools. This wasn't just about aesthetics. Long nails could harbor dirt and contribute to skin irritation, especially in an era of constant manual labor. Hair removal was also a practice, particularly among women of the nobility, who might remove hair from their eyebrows or foreheads to achieve the fashionable high hairline of the period. This was done using tweezers, or sometimes even harsh concoctions containing substances like arsenic or quicklime, which were incredibly dangerous but sometimes effective. For men, beards and hairstyles varied greatly by region and time, but keeping hair neat was a sign of respectability. Barbers, often also serving as surgeons, played a vital role in this, offering shaves and trims, not just for aesthetics but to maintain some level of personal order. These small, often overlooked, details paint a richer picture of how medieval individuals managed their personal presentation and comfort in a world without our modern conveniences. But beyond individual grooming, how did groups of people manage hygiene in specific, challenging environments? Beyond the relative confines of a home or a monastery, how did medieval hygiene fare in the most challenging and populous environments? Consider the army on campaign or the cramped quarters of a ship at sea. These were places where traditional, even limited, hygiene practices became incredibly difficult, if not impossible. For soldiers on campaign, marching through mud, sleeping in tents, and living on rations, opportunities for personal washing were almost non-existent. A stream might offer a quick dip for hands and face, but a full bath was a distant dream. Their primary defense against grime and body odor often fell to the simple act of changing their linen undergarments, if they had multiple sets, and relying on their outer woolens to absorb the worst of the dirt. Sanitation in army camps was rudimentary at best, with latrine pits dug and then moved as the camp shifted, leading to predictable issues with disease. The constant close proximity, poor waste disposal, and limited water for washing created conditions ripe for the spread of illness, a harsh reality for any medieval army. Life at sea was arguably even more challenging. On a medieval ship, fresh water was a precious commodity, strictly rationed for drinking, not for washing. Sailors would spend weeks, or even months, without a proper bath. Their clothes, often made of heavy wool, would become saturated with salt, sweat, and grime. Personal hygiene was limited to occasional rinses with salt water, which did little to cleanse and often irritated the skin further. The ships themselves were breeding grounds for pests, from rats and mice to lice and fleas, thriving in the damp, crowded conditions. Waste was simply thrown overboard, directly into the ocean. The air below deck would have been a suffocating mix of body odor, stale food, and bilge water. These extreme environments highlight just how much medieval hygiene was dictated by practical limitations and available resources, often forcing people to accept conditions that we would find unimaginable today, yet they adapted, endured, and continued to navigate their world. Moving from the more intimate aspects of personal care, let's cast our gaze wider to the public spaces of medieval towns and cities. Here, hygiene, or the lack thereof, presented a much larger, more communal challenge. Unlike modern cities with complex underground sewage systems, medieval towns rarely had such infrastructure. What sanitation existed was often rudimentary at best and, at worst, an open-air spectacle. Open sores were common, essentially ditches or gutters running down the center or sides of streets, designed to carry away waste. While a good idea in theory, these often became clogged with refuse, stagnating into foul-smelling, disease-breeding trenches that ran directly through residential and commercial areas. Waste from homes, as we've discussed, was frequently thrown into the streets, adding to the general miasma. This included not just the contents of chamber pots but also food scraps, animal offal from butchers, and general household rubbish. The primary sanitation workers were often pigs, dogs, and other scavenging animals that roamed freely, consuming whatever edible waste they could find. While this provided a crude form of waste disposal, it also meant that streets were constantly covered in animal droppings and other filth, making every step a gamble. Public markets, though vital hubs of commerce, were also centers of intense odor and unsanitary conditions, with blood, guts, and decaying produce underfoot. The lack of proper waste removal, combined with dense populations, meant that the air in medieval cities was thick with a pervasive, unforgettable stench, a constant backdrop to daily life that residents simply learned to endure. It was a clear demonstration of how deeply intertwined public health was with communal behavior and the rudimentary infrastructure of the age. It's also important to remember that medieval hygiene wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. Social hierarchy played a massive role in how clean, or rather, how comfortably uncomfortable, a person could be. For the wealthy and noble, while they certainly didn't live in conditions we'd consider pristine, they had significant advantages. They could afford servants to haul and heat water for baths, even if infrequent. Their large wooden tubs might be lined with expensive linen sheets and scented with precious herbs and oils. They owned multiple sets of costly linen undergarments, allowing for more frequent changes. Their homes, while perhaps smoky, were less crowded, and they could afford perfumes and pomanders to mask odors. They might even have guardrobes within their castles, offering a degree of privacy and convenience far beyond the reach of the average person. In stark contrast, the peasants and urban poor faced the most significant hygiene challenges. Their homes were often small, crowded, and lacked any dedicated washing facilities. Water had to be carried long distances from wells or rivers, making frequent washing a considerable chore. They owned fewer changes of clothes, meaning garments were worn for longer periods, absorbing more grime. Their access to soap, herbs, or perfumes was minimal to non-existent. For them, cleanliness was largely a matter of making do with what was readily available, bathing in rivers, using common pits for waste, and relying on basic linen tunics for absorbency. The social standing directly dictated not just wealth and power, but also the very practical means by which one could attempt to maintain personal cleanliness in a world without modern conveniences. This disparity in hygiene was another subtle, yet profound, marker of one's place in the intricate tapestry of medieval society. It's also important to remember that medieval hygiene wasn't a one-size-fits-all experience. Social hierarchy played a massive role in how clean, or rather, how comfortably uncomfortable, a person could be. For the wealthy and noble, while they certainly didn't live in conditions we'd consider pristine, they had significant advantages. They could afford servants to haul and heat water for baths, even if infrequent. Their large wooden tubs might be lined with expensive linen sheets and scented with precious herbs and oils. They owned multiple sets of costly linen undergarments, allowing for more frequent changes. Their homes, while perhaps smoky, were less crowded, and they could afford perfumes and pomanders to mask odors. They might even have guardrobes within their castles, offering a degree of privacy and convenience far beyond the reach of the average person. In stark contrast, the peasants and urban poor faced the most significant hygiene challenges. Their homes were often small, crowded, and lacked any dedicated washing facilities. Water had to be carried long distances from wells or rivers, making frequent washing a considerable chore. They owned fewer changes of clothes, meaning garments were worn for longer periods, absorbing more grime. Their access to soap, herbs, or perfumes was minimal to non-existent. For them, cleanliness was largely a matter of making do with what was readily available, bathing in rivers, using common pits for waste, and relying on basic linen tunics for absorbency. The social standing directly dictated not just wealth and power, but also the very practical means by which one could attempt to maintain personal cleanliness in a world without modern conveniences. This disparity in hygiene was another subtle, yet profound, marker of one's place in the intricate tapestry of medieval society. Beyond the practicalities of washing and waste, medieval people also lived in a world where the very elements and the changing seasons profoundly influenced their hygiene practices. Consider winter, for instance. Hauling water from a frozen well or river, and then heating it over a fire that constantly needed fuel, made bathing an even more arduous and less frequent event. The cold also meant that people bundled up in more layers of clothing, which, while offering warmth, also trapped more heat and moisture against the skin. In such conditions, the priority shifted from extensive washing to simply staying warm and preventing frostbite. The air was often thick with smoke from indoor fires, which might have masked some odors but certainly didn't contribute to respiratory health. Conversely, warmer months brought their own set of challenges. While water was more readily available from rivers and streams, The heat accelerated the decomposition of waste in the streets and increased body perspiration, intensifying the overall smells of towns and villages. The warmer weather also meant a boom in insect populations, bringing more flies, fleas, and other pests, adding to the pervasive itching and discomfort. Medieval people had to constantly adapt their limited hygiene routines to the rhythms of nature, understanding that what worked in one season might be impossible or even counterproductive in another. This constant negotiation with the environment underscored how deeply integrated their lives were with the natural world, a world that offered both the resources for cleanliness and the relentless challenges to achieving it. As the medieval era slowly gave way to the early modern period, the understanding of hygiene began a very gradual, almost imperceptible shift. While the sudden breakthroughs of germ theory were still centuries away, a growing curiosity about the human body and its functions, partly spurred by the devastating impact of plagues, started to challenge some older beliefs. Physicians, though still operating within the framework of humoral theory, began to pay more attention to environmental factors and the importance of fresh air, even if they didn't fully grasp why these elements mattered. The idea that certain smells or miasmas could carry disease persisted, but it also spurred efforts, however crude, to clean up public spaces and manage waste slightly more effectively, often driven by local ordinances and communal pressure. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow, evolving consciousness. The rediscovery of classical texts, the rise of new universities, and the exchange of ideas through trade routes all contributed to a more nuanced view of health and cleanliness. While widespread public bathing didn't immediately return to its earlier popularity, the focus on individual washing, particularly of hands and face, continued to be reinforced. The foundation for future innovations in sanitation and personal care was quietly being laid, one small observation and one persistent effort at cleanliness at a time. It highlights how history is a continuous flow, with old ideas gradually giving way to new, imperfect understandings that, step by step, pave the way for the world we know today. One fascinating, yet often misunderstood, aspect of medieval hygiene was its deep connection to the period's understanding of healing and remedies. Illness wasn't seen as caused by invisible germs, but by imbalances of the body's humors, or by corrupt air and bad odors. This belief directly influenced their hygiene practices. For instance, strong-smelling herbs weren't just for masking unpleasant odors. They were often thought to actively purify the air and ward off disease. Imagine burning aromatic wood or scattering potent herbs like rue and wormwood in sick rooms or public spaces. This wasn't just about making things smell better, but about actively combating what they believed were the sources of illness. Medieval medical texts, though far different from ours, frequently contained advice on personal cleanliness, even if it wasn't about daily bathing. They might recommend specific herbal washes for skin conditions, or suggest that certain foods were cleansing for the internal body. The concept of purging the body through sweating, vomiting, or bloodletting was also tied to their ideas of internal hygiene, a drastic attempt to rid the body of perceived impurities. Even practices like bathing the eyes with rose water or cleaning the ears with specific oils were part of a broader, holistic approach to maintaining bodily balance and health, even if their methods and reasoning differed so greatly from our modern understanding. It shows us how deeply interwoven their everyday habits were with their complex, often spiritual, medical beliefs. The practical tools and methods medieval people employed for their hygiene were often surprisingly ingenious, given the technological constraints of their time. We've touched upon some of these, but let's appreciate their widespread use. The humble linen cloth, for instance, was an absolute workhorse. Not just for clothing, but for daily wiping, drying, and even rudimentary tooth cleaning. Imagine a world where a piece of woven linen was your primary tool for personal freshening. Then there were the combs, made of bone, wood, or horn, essential for detangling hair and, critically, for fighting off the constant menace of lice. These weren't just functional, many were beautifully carved, showing a blend of utility and artistry. Beyond these everyday items, specific concoctions were developed using local resources. Ash and lye from wood fires were the core ingredients for their heavy-duty soaps, proving incredibly effective at cutting through grease for laundry, even if they were harsh on skin. Herbs were not just for scent but were integral to their perceived medicinal and cleansing properties, steeped in water for washes or used as poultices. Even common substances like vinegar found their place, used as a rinse for skin or hair, or even as a mouthwash, valued for its astringent and deodorizing qualities. These simple, often home-produced, tools and remedies highlight the remarkable resourcefulness of medieval people, adapting to their environment and making the most of what was readily available to maintain some semblance of personal cleanliness and well-being. It's fascinating to consider that medieval hygiene wasn't just a matter of practical daily habits, it was also influenced by written knowledge and the transmission of ideas. While not widely accessible to everyone, medical texts and household manuals of the time often contained advice on personal care. These texts, sometimes compiled in monasteries or by learned physicians, would detail recipes for herbal washes, methods for cleaning clothes, and recommendations for maintaining a healthy balance of the body's humors, which, as we discussed, directly impacted their view of cleanliness. These writings sometimes incorporated ancient Roman and Greek medical wisdom, filtered through medieval understanding, creating a unique blend of practical advice and theoretical health concepts. For instance, some texts might offer specific instructions for preparing a sweat bath to cleanse the body of impurities, or provide recipes for mouthwashes made from wine and spices. They might even discuss the best times of day or year for certain hygiene practices, aligning them with astrological beliefs or seasonal changes. While widespread literacy was uncommon, the knowledge contained within these scrolls and manuscripts would have been disseminated through barbers, apothecaries, and the lady of the manor, influencing how personal care was approached in different strata of society. This intellectual side of medieval hygiene reminds us that even without modern science, there was a continuous effort to understand, document, and improve methods of staying clean and healthy, however limited those improvements might seem to us today. Beyond the individual routines and beliefs we've explored, the very structure of medieval towns and cities profoundly impacted public hygiene. These were densely packed places, often growing organically within ancient walls, without the benefit of urban planning that considered modern sanitation. The narrow, winding streets, while picturesque in modern art, were often the primary channels for all manner of waste. Guilds and specific professions sometimes played an unwitting role in the sanitation efforts. For example, tanners, who processed animal hides, required vast amounts of water and produced incredibly foul-smelling waste, often discharging it directly into rivers or ditches that flowed through or near populated areas. Similarly, butchers would dispose of animal offal in ways that contributed significantly to the general stench and unsanitary conditions. Some towns did attempt rudimentary forms of public health management. There might be town criers who would warn residents before emptying their chamber pots into the street. Local ordinances, though often difficult to enforce, sometimes dictated where refuse could be dumped or ordered householders to sweep the street in front of their property. Waste collection, where it existed, was a far cry from today's organized systems. It might involve carting away larger refuse piles to designated areas outside the city walls, which would then become massive, festering middens. The concept of clean running water for public use was generally limited to wells or conduits that brought water from natural springs, often shared by many, and susceptible to contamination from the very waste flowing in the streets. These civic challenges highlight the constant, uphill battle medieval communities faced in trying to maintain a semblance of cleanliness amidst the realities of their urban environments. Medieval hygiene was also profoundly influenced by religious and spiritual beliefs. For many, physical cleanliness was intertwined with spiritual purity. While the church sometimes discouraged public bathing due to concerns about modesty and immoral behavior in bathhouses, it often promoted other forms of ritualistic washing and personal decorum as a sign of piety. Monks and nuns, as we briefly touched upon, were often among the cleanest members of medieval society, with their monastic rules frequently prescribing regular washing of hands, feet, and even scheduled full baths, all seen as part of their spiritual discipline and reverence for God's creation. For the wider populace, while a full bath might be rare, the act of washing hands before prayer or before receiving communion was a common and important ritual. This wasn't just about removing visible dirt, it carried a symbolic weight, signifying a cleansing of the soul and a preparation for sacred acts. Confession and repentance were seen as ways to achieve spiritual purity, sometimes diminishing the perceived need for extensive physical cleansing. The emphasis on inner cleanliness could, in some cases, overshadow the practical concerns of outer cleanliness, especially when juxtaposed with fears of disease entering through open pores. Pilgrimages, too, often involved specific rituals of washing, though these were more about spiritual purification in holy waters than a full-body scrub. This deep connection between the physical and the spiritual meant that hygiene was not merely a matter of comfort or health, but often a profound act of faith and devotion in the medieval world. Let's also consider the intricate dance of hygiene within the medieval household, where practices were often a communal effort, dictated by the resources available and the rhythms of daily life. For most families, particularly those in rural areas, the source of water was a shared well or a nearby river, meaning every bucket carried into the home was a precious commodity. This scarcity directly influenced how water was used for washing, often a small basin for hands and face, with leftover water perhaps being used for animals or plants, maximizing its utility. The hearth, the central point of the home, wasn't just for warmth and cooking, it played a crucial role in hygiene too. Water could be heated over the fire for washing, and smoky air was sometimes believed to purify the household, chasing away unseen miasmas. Bedding, often made of straw or simple wool, wasn't washed frequently, but would be aired out when possible, or herbs might be scattered within it to deter pests and add a fresher scent. Even the floor, usually earth or packed dirt, would be swept regularly, and rushes or straw might be laid down and then replaced, providing a simple, if temporary, layer of cleanliness. These domestic routines, though far from luxurious, illustrate the constant, diligent effort made by medieval families to maintain order and a degree of comfort within their private spaces, adapting basic elements of their environment into their daily hygiene practices. While we've touched upon the importance of linen undergarments in managing medieval body odor and grime, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the unsung hero that was the medieval shirt or shift. For men, the linen shirt was worn directly against the skin, beneath tunics and outer garments made of wool or fur. For women, the shift or chemise served the same purpose, a foundational garment under their gowns. These items were designed to be breathable, absorbent, and, crucially, washable. Think of them as a mobile buffer, capturing sweat, body oils, and shed skin cells, thus protecting the more elaborate and harder-to-clean outer layers. The idea was elegantly simple: wash the easily managed linen, not the entire, heavy, and often costly outfit. A nobleman might go weeks without washing his outer tunic, but he could change his pristine linen shirt every few days, giving the illusion, or at least the feeling, of freshness. This practice made linen a silent status symbol. A crisp, white, relatively clean linen shift was a clear sign of wealth and meticulousness, while a grimy, stained one spoke volumes about poverty or neglect. Even among peasants, a simple linen tunic served this vital absorptive purpose, though their options for frequent changes were far more limited. This reliance on a simple inner layer was a remarkably practical solution to the persistent challenges of medieval body cleanliness, a testament to how even the most basic elements of clothing became integral to their daily fight against dirt and discomfort. It's also worth delving a little deeper into the medieval equivalent of our modern personal care products. Without factories churning out precisely formulated soaps and creams, medieval people relied heavily on home-produced, often wild-harvested, ingredients. The sheer ingenuity in concocting these solutions is truly remarkable. For example, while we think of soap as a solid bar, many medieval soaps were more like a thick paste or a liquid made from the careful combination of animal fats and wood ash, boiled down to create a rudimentary, but effective, cleaning agent. The fat, often from pigs or sheep, would be collected from cooking, and the ash from the hearth. This process, known as saponification, was understood long before its chemistry was fully grasped, providing a powerful degreaser for laundry and occasional body washes. Beyond soap, the medieval pantry and garden were crucial for personal hygiene. Herbs were not just for cooking, they were vital for scent, antiseptic properties, and even pest control. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and chamomile were commonly used in washes, infused in bathwater, or tucked into clothing sachets. Vinegar, a common household staple, served multiple purposes. It was used as a mild astringent for the skin, a hair rinse to add shine and repel lice, and even as a mouthwash. Oils, often olive or almond oil, were used not just for cooking but also for moisturizing dry skin, often mixed with herbs for a pleasant scent. These were the true beauty products of the age, born of necessity and a deep knowledge of the natural world, rather than chemical synthesis. They remind us that even without our sophisticated industries, people found ways to care for their bodies using the bounty around them. So, after exploring the varied and often surprising world of medieval hygiene, we're left with a crucial question: did it actually work? Or was everyone simply one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion, as some popular history might suggest? The short answer is, it worked well enough, especially when viewed through the lens of their time, not ours. If you were to time travel back to, say, the year 1347, your nostrils would almost certainly file for divorce, overwhelmed by a symphony of unfamiliar scents. But within their own context, medieval people were far from oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a very different scale of what clean truly meant. They developed intricate systems and tools, even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks, lice combs, and the rather dubious practice of hurling chamber pots out windows. They understood the value of fresh linen layers to absorb grime and keep the body relatively clean. They utilized readily available resources like vinegar, herbs, and ash-based soap for cleansing and freshening. And they certainly had their own rituals, whether it was the focused sponge bath before Sunday Mass, or the laborious, yet vital, process of boiling and beating laundry by the river. Hygiene existed, but it was deeply interwoven with their fears about disease, their faith, and the dictates of the weather. In many ways, medieval people were doing the absolute best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own perpetually itchy armpits. The idea of regular, full-body bathing, as we know it, was often seen as risky, incredibly time-consuming, and thanks to evolving church doctrine and terrifying plague fears, medically unwise. So, they got inventive. And, surprisingly, some of their practices, like the reliance on breathable linen or the methodical removal of pests, have echoes in our own understanding of basic cleanliness, even if our methods are dramatically different today. It was a journey of adaptation, ingenuity, and a constant negotiation with the very real, very present realities of a world that was both magnificent and, undeniably, a little bit smelly. Ultimately, understanding medieval hygiene means stepping into a different mindset, one where the entire relationship between humanity, nature, and the divine was viewed through a unique lens. Their world wasn't just dirtier, it operated on a different set of rules, where knowledge was passed down through generations, often mixing practical observation with deeply held superstitions and religious beliefs. The challenges they faced were immense: no running water systems, limited scientific understanding of disease, and a constant struggle for basic survival. Their daily routines were shaped not by convenience, but by necessity and a desire to stay healthy in a way they understood. The medieval person wasn't ignorant. They were adapting, innovating, and making logical decisions based on the information and resources available to them. They were, in their own way, quite sophisticated in their approaches, even if those approaches seem primitive to us. So, as we gently bring our journey to a close, remember that the story of medieval hygiene is not just about dirt and smells, but about resilience, resourcefulness, and a fascinating insight into the daily lives of people who, despite their differences, were just trying to live their lives, one day, and one, sometimes less than fragrant, step at a time. The medieval person wasn't ignorant, far from it. They were incredibly adaptable, innovative, and made logical decisions based on the information and resources available to them at the time. Their approaches to personal care, while seemingly rudimentary to us, were, in their context, quite sophisticated. They meticulously managed what they could control, from the linen layers that absorbed their daily grime to the creative uses of herbs and ashes. They learned to live with pervasive odors and pests, developing coping mechanisms that became integrated into the fabric of their daily lives. So, as we gently bring our immersive journey to a close, remember that the story of medieval hygiene is not just about dirt and smells. It's a rich tapestry woven with threads of resilience, resourcefulness, evolving beliefs, and a fascinating insight into the daily lives of people who, despite their stark differences from us, were just trying to navigate their world, one day, and one, sometimes less than fragrant, step at a time. It's a quiet testament to how human ingenuity always finds a way, even in the most challenging and, yes, often pungent, circumstances. The echoes of their practices, and the lessons learned, continued to shape how people thought about cleanliness for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the more sanitized world we inhabit today. But our journey doesn't quite end with a final farewell. The story of medieval hygiene, in its quiet, unassuming way, actually holds a mirror to our own time. Consider how much our own understanding of cleanliness has evolved, even in just the last century. We went from a world where doctors didn't regularly wash their hands before surgery to one where antiseptic gels are ubiquitous. This rapid evolution shows us that what we consider clean is always, to some extent, a product of our scientific knowledge, our cultural norms, and even our economic capabilities. The medieval person's aversion to hot baths during a plague wasn't foolishness, it was a rational, if ultimately incorrect, conclusion based on the prevailing medical theories of miasma. They were trying to protect themselves with the best information they had. Today, we face new challenges and new understandings of health, from microscopic viruses to environmental pollutants. And just as medieval people adapted, finding ingenious ways to cope with their circumstances, so too do we continually adapt our hygiene practices. The next time you effortlessly turn on a tap for hot water, or reach for a scented soap, take a moment to reflect on that long, winding journey of human cleanliness. It's a subtle reminder that history isn't just about grand battles and royal intrigue. It's also about the everyday struggles and surprising innovations that shaped how we live, how we perceive ourselves, and how we interact with the world around us. The echoes of those medieval solutions, from linen shirts to herbal rinses, whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that even the most basic human needs have a rich, complex, and utterly fascinating history waiting to be discovered. So, as we finally prepare to part ways with the medieval world, let's take a moment for quiet reflection. Tonight, we've unraveled the layers of misconceptions surrounding medieval hygiene, revealing a picture far more nuanced than simple dirtiness. We've seen how fear of disease, evolving religious doctrines, and a rudimentary understanding of the human body shaped practices that seem baffling to us now. Yet, through it all, we witnessed remarkable resourcefulness and resilience. People used what they had, ashes, herbs, urine, linen, to manage their bodies and their environments in ways that made practical sense to them. This journey reminds us that history isn't a static collection of facts, but a living tapestry woven with the daily experiences of real people. Their struggles with cleanliness, their inventions, and their beliefs are not just quaint anecdotes. They are windows into a different way of life, highlighting the universal human desire for comfort, health, and dignity, even in the most challenging times. It's a quiet testament to how human ingenuity always finds a way, even in the most challenging and, yes, often pungent, circumstances. The echoes of their practices, and the lessons learned, continued to shape how people thought about cleanliness for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the more sanitized world we inhabit today. As you settle into the quiet of the night, perhaps you'll find a new appreciation for the simple luxury of a hot shower, the scent of clean laundry, or the reassuring feel of fresh toothpaste. These everyday comforts are not accidents. They are the culmination of centuries of human endeavor, building upon the quiet, often uncelebrated, efforts of those who came before us. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with clean sheets and the fascinating whispers of history.